Hello, my name is John Brewley and I'm chairing this talk by Jack Matlack. I just want to say something very briefly to begin with about the A.D. Smith Fellowship. This is named after Anthony D. Smith, who held the chair of Ethnicity and Nationalism at LSE. It was set up after Anthony's death by his widow Diana, whom I hope is watching this talk from home. The purpose of the fellowship is to enable an early career scholar to stay in London for a couple of months, based at LSE in the Ideas Institute, where they can pursue a particular line of research, perhaps by having access to special libraries or archives, or being able to consult with other researchers. Jack Matlack is the second holder of this fellowship. He is a PhD student at the Graduate School of East and Southeast European Studies at the University of Regensburg, and a doctoral researcher at the Leibniz Science Campus at the University of Regensburg. His first degree was in History, International Relations and German from Syracuse University in New York. His MA was in European American Studies from the University of Regensburg, one of Germany's very few area studies programs. He tells me he was drawn to Regensburg for this very reason, to be able to study history in the transnational framework and to engage with historical questions beyond and between nation states. Jack aims to complete his PhD by the end of the summer of this year. He received the 2023 Anthony D. Smith Visiting Fellowship to support his research proposal, Manoeuvring Westward, which concerns training exercises of the US Army and the German Army in the period of the Cold War. Today's talk is entitled The Army, the Nation, Nuclear Annihilation, Constructing Western Identity in German-American NATO Training Exercises of the Cold War. Over to you, Jack.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. Before I begin with my presentation, I want to extend a word of thanks, first and foremost, to Professors John Hutchinson and John Brewley for their academic mentorship during my time as a fellow. Further thanks is due to ASEN, the Association for the Study of Ethnicity and Nationalism, for facilitating and offering this fellowship. I'm similarly indebted to Dr. David Landon Cole for his guidance and support throughout and beyond my stay in London. Thank you as well to LSE Ideas for providing a collegial and intellectual environment for my study. And to Regensburg, I'd like to additionally thank Professors Ulf Bodenbauer, Paul Vickers, and my two advisors, Professors Holger Dubkat and Juliana Thoman. And most especially, I want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Diana Smith for endowing this fellowship to honor the late Professor Anthony Smith. It was an express privilege to count myself among the countless other younger scholars who stand to carry on his academic legacy. So, a rather imperious title I've chosen. I thought I might share with you what sparked my interest in this topic in the first place. So in 2016, when I was still considered cool to be American in Germany when Obama was president, I was a master's student in search of a thesis topic. And as if to answer my prayers, falling literally from the sky were unfastened to parachutes US Army Humvees that fell just north of Regensburg. I'll arrest any concern you might have. No animals or people were harmed. But nonetheless, it was quite striking to have it literally raining army vehicles. I had a number of questions. And so, proceeding from this initial encounter with the United States Army, my home country, and my new country, Germany, in sort of intimate proximity, I quickly discovered that this was in fact a feature of the relationship between Germany and the United States, and not a bug. So, because John Brewley privately confessed to me his undying affection and admiration for American baseball, I thought I might ground the structure of my presentation with a sports analogy. I'll begin at home plate, where I will offer my primary argument and expand on my understanding of the nation and national identity in the context of my research. At first base, I'll advance to the objects of my investigation, that being my beloved Cold War training exercises between the German Army and the US Army. At this stage, I'll present to you the aspects of scale and space, the exercise, battlefields, along with some of the more fun aspects, of performing mock war. Thereafter, we'll run towards second, where I'll briefly touch on the prevailing NATO strategies of the 1950s and 1960s. It's a bit of a sea of acronyms, but NATO strategy really is essential here, for it is against this backdrop that I will compare the warfighting scenarios of my training exercises. How well do the scenarios of training exercises adhere to the codified strategies of the time? Having achieved this, we'll arrive at our final stop, where I'm going to call it sort of a tale of two exercises. First, we have Operation Winter Shield in 1961, and second, Operation Black Lion in 1968. With these two exercises, I'll attempt to substantiate my claims on how the nation influenced the prosecution of German-American training exercises. Now, a quick note on terminology. I want to proactively address before I get too deep into the details. In terms of source material, the term war game, maneuver, training exercise, FTX, which means field training exercise, they're all used more or less interchangeably in the source material. But really what I mean and what I want you to focus on is exclusively such military undertakings that are in the field and in being. That means no tabletop simulations, no, they did paper training as well. I don't mean that. The rest we can discuss in the questions. But yeah, and I included the original German terms as well, Manöver and Übung, which are more or less in line with what I choose to call them, simply training exercises or maneuvers. In case anyone's curious, speaking of my source material, here's where I've collected it in all of its glory. By and large, I have a mix of German Federal Archives, U.S. National, and U.S. Army archives. And to sort of capture the voice of a local perspective, I've gone to city archives. Similarly, I've undertook substantial research in the archives of the East German Ministry for State Security, the East German National People's Army, and the Communist Party leadership, so that we have our transnational framework. What sort of material am I basing all of this on? Essentially, I rely on the logistical exercise reports and what are called after-action reports, where officers are invited to reflect upon the training exercises. That is to say, the perspective of my project and of my research is exclusively from the officer corps. I do not have any source material in a meaningful sense from the common soldier. My challenge to you as the audience would be, are officers, often 25-year-olds from Arkansas or somewhere in Bielefeld, are they really elite actors just because they are officers, commanding soldiers, in the field? Now, real quick, I'm assuming most of you have never really heard of this topic and have no understanding, and that is great. So, this is a map of Operation Winter Shield. Just to get this into your head, we'll move on quickly. All training exercises that I look at involve anywhere from 20 to 70,000 troops deployed in the field in the same format. It is always a red team, who are the Soviets, and blue team, who are NATO. I've drawn very beautiful arrows on the map. This is southern Bavaria. Upper Bavaria is apparently invading the Oberpfalz in this training scenario. But essentially, large groups of forces move and they engage in sort of rehearsed dramatic warfare, obviously with no real bullets. But that is what I'll be talking about throughout this presentation. So, I'm going to proceed from this idea that there is even a such thing as a national way of war. So let's begin with the broadest possible parameters. Why even compare US and German armies in the first place? Well, first, while there's an absolute deluge of quality literature on US-German connections in the Cold War, there are actually relatively few overt comparative studies between the US Army and the German Army. As Hartmut Kehle argues, comparative studies do have the potential to subvert national narratives in history and also the common problem of methodological nationalism for writers. This is especially the case with studies on the US military, as sometimes, not always, the lack of a juxtaposition of another counterpart can lead to the inherent elevation and subsequent endorsement of American exceptionalism. Jörg Echtenkamp advocates military history as perfectly well suited for comparative studies on the lines of Histoire croisée and entangled encounters. But both Echternkamp and Kebele are firm on the proposition that comparative studies must be balanced in terms of source density, among other elements in their investigations. While the US military in the Cold War was spectacular in scale, it gobbled 10% of GDP, compared to today only 3%, which is $1 trillion a year, so it's truly immense. Can you really compare the US Army and the German Army? But as it so happens, when you look at the West German context in the Cold War, the US Army was smaller than the German Army, thus making the comparison more valid. This, just to get this out of the way, you could look at a German-French comparison or a UK-German comparison. But in terms of raw numbers in the field, the US Army had 250,000 soldiers, and the Bundeswehr at its height had around 500,000. The French and the UK armies were much smaller by comparison. Now, to undergird this comparison, I employ two conceptual frameworks to guide my thinking. First, German historian Reinhard Koselleck endorses the dichotomy or the frameworks of a space of experience and a horizon of expectation, as opposed to juxtaposing concepts like war and peace or work and leisure. Koselleck contends that the past can be understood in spatial terms, as there's no chronology to experience. In this reading, the self-perception of the past is always assembled, sort of ad hoc, into a totality in any given context. So to think of how you consider the past, you don't think of a direct chronology of all your experiences perfectly. Expectations of the future in this way are always seen as fragmented, constructed, and narrow. It's a horizon. It is inherently limited. One exists in tandem with another. As Koselleck says, there is no expectation without experience, and no experience without expectation. So when I take a step back, I would argue that all training exercises, they employ a scenario. They have assumptions. The enemy will attack on this day. We assume the following political environment brings us to this moment. My question is, when investigating these exercise scenarios, I ask, what understanding and experience of the past informs the knowledge production or the knowledge basis of the two officer corps? When there's a scenario constructed, what experiences of the past do the Germans bring versus the Americans? And what expectations of the future do they have? And like everything, it is contested. There's not one German and one American imagination of the future and experience of the past. But there are certainly nationalized experiences. For example, in the Second World War, the German experience is isolated to that of the belligerent power, and so on. Now, like with everything, there is a pithy German word to summarize a concept. In this instance, Kriegsbild, or an image of war. I'd love if there was a better translation, but Kriegsbild, unfortunately, that is what we have. My argument is that an image of war, it captures this notion of future war, or what Koselleck calls possible futures, or past futures. Every exercise has an image of war, a Kriegsbild, an imagined scenario that they attempt to play out. My major contention is that perceptions of future war were informed by national sentiments. Imagined future war was therefore channeled through the nationalized experiences of the past and expectations of the nation in the future. Right. So, nations in exercises. In investigating my exercises, I follow Susanne Lachenich and Volker Depkart's approach, or their sort of challenge, by using transnational history to guide my analysis of the question of quote-unquote where, when, why, and in which respects nations and nation-states actually became relevant as historical factors. In this reading, the nation is historically contingent in relation to the groups and individuals sustaining it. So consider the German army. Was the German nation in the wars of unification in 1866 and 1871 the same nation in the minds of their soldiers in World War I, to say nothing of the Second World War? As I will try to show you, asking why and in which respect the German nation of the Cold War in this context plays a role, and how does it play a role in Cold War military maneuvers. And I believe that out of that we will find a very different conception of the German nation and the American nation, as in previous conflicts. Now, war and the military, they are fundamental to both the American and German national histories. Both the United States and Germany were states formed in armed conflict. And again, relying on Jürg Echternkampf and Sven Oliver Müller's understanding, collective violence in war legitimizes the state and its sovereignty, which the state then ultimately relies upon the construct of the nation. Participation in state violence therefore increases the self-identification of the participants in war with the nation-state's enemies, or their perceived enemies. But I ask you this, what do we do when there is no opportunity for overt violence, and that war might not happen at all? See, this is where nuclear weapons bring in an interesting component. Do nuclear weapons utterly preclude war entirely between the great powers? The Estonian scholar Igor Kopotin, he articulates this idea that military training is the school of the nation, that where the enemy from abroad is sort of communicated and cemented into the minds of soldiers or young people entering the military, where one language is used, and where identification with the state along national lines becomes more concrete, as the state becomes the arbiter, the protector, and the ultimate political manifestation for its young recruits. So this guides well into Eric Hobsbawm. Primarily, I'm focused on the interconnectivity of the nation and the state, and how the former, and how the state instrumentalizes the construction of the nation. Hobsbawm asserts that the state may not have been the only stage for political activity, but, quote, its existence, frontiers, and increasingly regular and probing interventions in citizens' lives are decisive in this dynamic. By pointing to the standardization of administration and law, state education, and of course in this case, the military, the state transforms its citizens and instigates an intensified entanglement with whatever national history the military chooses to teach. And what then is the army, if not the product of the centralized state administration, of state-mandated education and required compulsory service? And then also look at Wolfgang Schivelbusch, who, in reflecting on the army's qualities as the so-called nation in arms, he exclaims that armies, their triumphs, their losses, and also their retreats, they embody those of the nation. Perceptions of national honor therefore reflect on the army's performance, both in peace, I would argue, and in war. Schivelbusch claims that this perception is universal and ancient. He points to the Trojan hero Hector, who fights Achilles, and claims that when Hector retreats as a tactic to exhaust a superior Greek opponent, it is seen as retreat, and that, Schivelbusch argues, readers conflate this retreat with cowardice, when it was merely the way he chose to fight. Backward movement is seen, therefore, as morally detrimental, not just in war, as I will argue, but in peaceful or in peacetime military training. Bear this thought in mind as I then show you some of the exercises. This idea of retreat as morally detrimental and as advance as sort of the success of the nation. Advance, therefore, there is tantamount to victory, and retreat as an admission of defeat. The army as the nation in arms can be quite contradictory, though, if you think about it. Both the U.S. Army and German Army drew heavily upon conscripts in the Cold War. Daniel Moran observes that in such contexts as the French Revolution, where national conscription gained its earliest and most prominent expression, quote-unquote, patriotism and republicanism acquired supreme moral value, according to Moran, with the coercive nature of revolutionary military recruitment rendered to be a merely invisible tool of the state. That military service is at the same time compulsory, but simultaneously framed as a symbol of freedom and liberty, is inherent to this dynamic. And what do we do as historians, again, when we don't have any real wars to analyze in the Cold War setting? Is the army still the nation in arms when it has no wars to fight? Interrogating exercises as source material, in my view, is most expedient in historical contexts where war is lacking. Jakob Vogel, in his book, Nations in Lockstep, examined field training during the Imperial German period before World War I, especially in exercises with the Kaiser's personal participation. Vogel observes that these maneuvers serve to nationalize the army, with the Kaiser, of course, as the physical embodiment of state and nation. He, too, employs the term School of Nation, like Igor Kropotkin, to discuss military training. In the Russian context, John Steinberg, he further purports that exercise scenarios were actually foundational in their importance, at being the assumptions and the mechanisms of the exercise themselves. He writes that if the Tsar, in this case, personally participates, the Tsar must win. More importantly, he must be seen to have won, both by his troops and by the public and the foreign press, if there was one. Imagine the unmitigated disaster if the emperor was seen to retreat in an exercise. Yes. Now, before we move on, I want to submit an open question to the audience, something that we can come back to in the discussion. Yes, sorry. Ernest Gellner, he views modern inventions such as plow, the sword, and the book as intricately involved with the history and realization of the nation. Where might nuclear weapons, in the broadest possible view, fit into this equation, if they do at all? Does the threat of nuclear weapons represent a point of departure, a moment of rupture in our understanding of the nation? No less a writer than George Orwell writes right after the Second World War that, yes, he writes in his article, "You and the Atom Bomb," that nuclear weapons are a tool of the elite, and that in his view the musket is a martial tool that makes all men tall, and that is fundamentally democratic, as any human being can seize a rifle. But only a ruling class in the state can use nuclear weapons. So I'm curious what you might perceive of that, and what you have thoughts on. After all, Hobsbawm himself, he sort of cheekily comments in the opening of his book that humanity most likely will destroy itself through nuclear weapons, and that a quote-unquote intergalactic historian will seek to elucidate our past, beginning by trying to understand the nation. But I wonder if somehow nuclear weapons have a role there as well. Now, I have a few concluding remarks here before we get into the actual teeth. But essentially, my argument is that the state performs its own enemies along national lines. Now, please, in the discussion, we only have 30 minutes. Ask me about the enemy as portrayed in these exercises. I don't go into it here. But as I say, in these exercises, there's always a red team. And wouldn't you know it, it is always performed along the German past experience with the Soviet Union, given that the United States had none to speak of. When we look at Germany, I argue that their understanding of the nation, it sort of constricts to national survival, superseding national unification. One thing you will notice in these training exercises is they never test the scenario of reunification. There is never, and I trust me, never, much as these Germans would argue the counter, any sort of fictive attempt to liberate East Germany by means of military arms. When we look at how the American nation functions, it's sort of balancing its understanding of national exceptionalism with its own nuclear vulnerability. The idea being that Germany sort of served as a new frontier, a new space for America to be defended, far from its own borders, to protect the homeland. Now, I haven't talked about the West at all, and this is somewhat on purpose, even though it's in the title. I kind of embrace the idea that Linda Colley brings forth in her book on British national identity. The idea that I don't think I can prove that Western identity definitively existed in the minds of every soldier and every officer. But what if instead, as Depka and Lachenik propose, I ask, where and how is the nation important, and I apply it to the West? The idea being, where can I find Western identity's expression in military training exercises? My argument is, if you look at the concrete combat and tactical exchanges that are planned, the logic that undergirds this imagined warfare, you don't find strictly national logic. There's not a purely German way of war or an American way of war. And here we might find, and we might discover, a Western way of war, as Christopher Poker would put it. Now, cool. I made this nice little slide. I was a bit, it doesn't format well. Trust me when I made it, the flags lined up perfectly, but the trend still suffices. Throughout my own dissertation project, I'm looking at around 10 to 15 exercises. All of them, of course, are gigantic. I don't want to look at the small ones. 20 to 70,000 participating forces, which also does not include supporting forces, fuel, logistics, and the like. And up to 15,000 armored vehicles and tanks participating. Now, if you look at the exercises, you don't have to worry about the names, but the host nation is important. All of them occur in West Germany, and yet the nation or the country leading the exercise, sort of providing the plot basis, the mechanisms, forcing some sort of narrative plot. It begins primarily with the United States, and as the 1960s advance, slowly becomes more of the purview of the German army. Now, it's unfortunately slightly hidden. You'll have to... we'll only be looking at these two exercises, Winter Shield and Black Lion, the Schwarze-Bürger. But this is a sort of a handoff that I'll be pointing to. This was agony to do. I just hope you can appreciate it. This is the size of every training ground in Germany. Now you're probably asking, where do they do these exercises? Well, they had training grounds. You might notice a bit of a trend, though. The training grounds that are the largest size by hectares, not acres, who are in control of them? By the way, the NATO symbol means that they're shared use. And then who controls the smallest training grounds, with only 1,000 hectares versus 23,000 in Grafenbrühl? If you look at who occupies or who owns the largest training ground spaces in Germany, it's the United States, then shared use, then France, who cheekily leave the combined NATO structure in 1966. And then you have Germany in their own country with their own training spaces. This is an elaborate way for you to know that when the German army wanted to exercise, they had to coordinate and more or less ask permission from the United States Army to use a training ground located in their own country. Now, what were these training spaces like? If you ask the military, they were empty. The U.S. Army even calls it undeveloped terrain of northern Bavaria. Here we have at Baumholder Range, you see a U.S. Army firing exercise with several hundred to several thousand observers. Then, of course, you have this wide open field where U.S. Army soldiers are sort of scurrying about. That's what they would like you to believe. Now, how did they perform some type of mock war? Well, they got quite playful with the pyrotechnics. They would have smoke machines, they would have fake artillery rounds, they would have, what are they called, blank rounds, what they would fire at each other, that sound exactly like real rounds, to add a sort of bit of drama and gravitas. But really, in reality, there were millions of people living in these spaces. And as you can see, they were quite curious as to what they were observing. I'm going to read directly quite a wonderful quote, which I hope I can now find. Yes. This photo was taken by a U.S. Army photographer during one of my training exercises. It shows a U.S. Army tank depicted as a Soviet tank. It was a part of the Red Team, storming through a village where it then fired upon the NATO invader coming from the south. This is in Burg Langenfeld, which is just north of Regensburg. The photo reads, "The sham battle took place in this northern Bavarian town when screening elements of defending forces ambushed the enemy column. The townspeople swarmed to the scene and watched with broad smiles as the tanks fired blanks, the machine gun squads and the riflemen deployed, and the return of fire, also blanks, of the ambushing units. When resistance was overcome, the convoy moved on through the town, and the Germans returned to their prosaic tasks," which I just think is a fantastic quote. Now, just to give you a small little anecdote, this was a contested space, cohabitated by a foreign military, by the German military, and by the local population. In one instance, I found a letter where a U.S. Army officer arrested several potato farmers who had been chasing his vehicle. He then was confronted by the Bavarian state police, who said, "Why are you arresting these men? This is their land." To which the American officer answered, "The whole of Germany is our training area, and we may act as we want." Now, again, we don't have time, but if you want to ask about this, I know the entire legal history of the maneuver rights, which was also agony. But again, suffice it to say, and what's really important is the takeaway here, the Allied powers had significant authority to hold exercises. Before 1963, they did not even have to announce them. Sometimes they would announce to the local authorities once they had already begun. Again, 70,000 troops, 1,200 tanks. You might be perturbed if you were a local, especially, and I do have evidence to support this, up to 100 German citizens died per year in the early 1960s from motor vehicle accidents, not expecting a tank column on the Autobahn, so to speak. I had another thought. Well, we'll move on. Now we get to the zany part, which is they're imagining warfare. You can't actually nuke northern Bavaria in your attempts to show fidelity to NATO strategic assumptions that that is how you would defend against a Soviet attack. Here's a really lovely image I found. This is a bridge near Kiel, which is on the French border. This bridge, obviously, you can't blow it up. So what they did is the German army would create these illustrated stencils, and they'd hand them out to some of their officers so that they could imagine what the bridge might look like were they to blow it up. That is, of course, if they could agree on which bridge had in fact been imaginatively and fictively blown up. I have this great quote from a German officer who says, for example, this bridge was destroyed by a direct hit, according to their resources. But the first French army stated that, in fact, the impact was 300 meters downstream. And thus the French units, as well as their supply traffic, rolled merrily over an irradiated bridge. Every exercise is filled with delightful tidbits where they just don't agree on whatever it is, whatever manner of conflict they are trying to perform. Now, everyone's eyes might glaze over. Just bear with me, I promise. We'll talk about it and it'll be a way. The strategy and state. Strategy and the state. In the 1950s, U.S. President Dwight Eisenhower, he oversaw the creation of the American doctrine of massive retaliation. It's meant to be as formidable as it sounds. Massive retaliation foresaw ground forces in Central Europe, and we, as historians now derogatively call it, tripwire forces. Their job was to be the first to die in a campaign to annihilate the Soviet Union were they to attack NATO. Eisenhower's idea was, first, it's quite cheap. You don't need to have as many troops if the plan is for them to not survive. That wasn't his words, mine. Second, with massive retaliation, he believed this created true deterrence. That if the Soviets believed that even the slightest incursion on NATO territory, does this sound familiar with today's conflict? The slightest incursion would be met with absolute nuclear annihilation. Now, Dwight Eisenhower, as the former Allied commander in the Second World War, perhaps this might have been believable, but he would have done it. What if, say, someone was elected president, we're not thinking about that, and he was 43 from Boston, and the older Soviet leader believed, I'm not so sure that he has the gall, if I were to move into Berlin and build a wall, to essentially bring about the destruction of Western civilization. In the 60s, we see the emergence of flexible response, which then becomes the dominant NATO doctrine of the rest of the Cold War. Now, I gave the names of the documents. Actually, those are the strategic concepts, but MC48-2 and MC48-3, they are irrelevant documents if you want to ask about that. in the questions. But essentially, NATO's strategy adopts massive retaliation in the 1950s, and Operation Winter Shield, which I'll show you, proceeds from the assumptions of massive retaliation. But then, by the late 1960s, flexible response comes in. And this is heavily influenced by the Germans. Of course, you see, they were not so enthusiastic about the idea of full nuclear annihilation were Berlin to be attacked. Also, what is the point of building a 500,000-man German military if, after all, it's just to be a tripwire? This was, after all, a very good argument. And so, throughout the 1960s, eventually enshrined an MC-14-3, an MC-48-3 in 1969, NATO transitioned to a doctrine that foresees a conventional defense with large forces in the field that then will only, of course, resort to nuclear weapons exchange when they get overpowered, or if they get overpowered. I do love this quote from Colin Powell, who later became the Joint Chief of Staff of the United States military in the Gulf War, and of course Secretary of State. He reflects on his time in the 1960s in Germany, and he says, "We were thinly deployed along the general defense plan line, and once the Russians started coming, we were to fight like the devil, fall back, and watch the nuclear cataclysm begin." You might see a slight difference in the German view, which I also have very bad little lines I drew on a map because I couldn't find a better one. But essentially, NATO's strategies throughout the 50s and 60s can be best described as transitioning from a very, very, very conservative defense along the Rhine River, this yellow line, which geography enthusiasts will notice does not include most of Germany, meaning the Germans, were they even to build their army, would be abandoned according to NATO's strategy. By 1957, they advanced the line to the Weser River, which was an improvement, but ultimately was not satisfying to the Germans. And by the 60s, there is an aim to move the line forward in what's called forward defense. And this is where we see this reflected in training exercises. There's always a grand counterattack, because of course, the Soviet Union has superior numbers and superior firepower. But NATO hoped to push the conflict away from the West German border in as far as east as possible. And that was the essential logic of flexible response. Now, a useful quote for this end is the so-called psychological problem of the German army from an officer, where he describes that throughout training exercises, defenders of German territory, by virtue of the strategy, were currently, this in the 50s, they were envisioned to move backward without a fight and retreat to whatever safe line NATO determined. He believed that this would entail serious psychological effects. Now, this is sort of a code. I'm not sure they fully had a systematic definition of what psychological means. But what they mean in all the reports, psychological effects is sort of a nationalized term to mean how Germans would negatively respond to the moral problems of losing the Third World War. So, in observation of time, I'm going to sort of crash through my first exercise. We have Winter Shield 2. There were 2 exercises. They never did a third. This is the map again. It's a fictive situation where you have southern Bavaria is now an aggressor state. They are the enemy. The international border runs across the Danube River, to which they will attack the Federal Republic of Germany, which in this instance begins at the Danube River, and engage in an attack. The lines, right? So the red lines represent the initial stage of the exercise, where Team Red, the Soviet team, they stage very aggressive offensive operations across the Danube River, which is actually quite a deep and wide river, and they attack the blue team defenders in the north. Now, in this exercise, you have the U.S. 5th and the U.S. 7th Corps facing off against each other. This represents the cream of the crop, the largest contingency of U.S. forces in Germany. But on each side, you have German units and French units supporting them. On the next stage of the exercise, red advances north, continuously pushing blue back. Now here's where I'll draw conclusions at the end. On the third phase, the blue team mounts a heroic counterattack, pushes red back towards the starting line of battle, and the exercise ends thusly where they began, where NATO repulses the attack back south of the river where it began. You see where there's a sort of a narrative aspect to this. The Soviets are the aggressor, they instigate the attack, the war. They then push NATO, but not too far. They don't give up that much territory before again the counterattack ensues, and NATO is successfully able to repel the enemy attack, pushing it back to where they began. How many nuclear weapon blasts do you think were simulated in this exercise? Think of a number. It's 300 plus. Now, this space is smaller than Luxembourg. It's only about 2,000 square kilometers. 300 atomic artillery blasts. And here's the best part, Team Blue fired more. Of course, to simulate it, just so you can get your head around it, the way that they did it was they would spray paint a gigantic circle in the field and say, here we are, a nuclear bomb has dropped. There wasn't really a way to show it. The average blue team unit was eliminated 19 times a day. Units were completely evaporated by the nuclear artillery. And you might be asking, where did the counterattack come from if the forces were completely destroyed? This is especially relevant for the US military, as, despite their heroic attempts, there were not hundreds of thousands of American-trained youth living in Germany to act as a reserve force. When they lost it, they're gone. Of course, the German army had more substantial reserves. But you see where things are getting a little ludicrous. Under massive retaliation, no exercise is politically feasible. Germany has turned into a complete nuclear hellscape, and the American forces are more than happy to do this because, of course, this is not the United States. They are performing their duty. This does have significant effects. When you read through these reports from the German armed forces, one officer who's on the blue team, he reflects that the constant falling back in the initial days of the exercise was psychologically detrimental to his blue forces. For he argued that to the young soldiers the impression became that war simply was tantamount to retreat. And that then, he continues in the report, he's afraid that in the new democratic Germany, hundreds of thousands of youth conscripts will return home and tell their friends and their family that the German army's plan is to retreat from day one. Now, the American experience from this exercise is quite interesting. One general, Fred Brown, he talks, and I'm going to use vague words here, he says, "We knew from the moment we came upon them. It was almost like the old days, and I was really glad to have them on our side this time. It was a magnificent sight, gentlemen, the maneuvering tanks in the bright sunshine and snow. Quite a tank man's dream." What he's referring to is the German army. And he later says in the report, that of the Second World War. He was quite happy to see the former enemy on the American side. And I included this little image here. This is what the code is always in the German reports, die alte Erfahrung, the old experience from the Second World War that they bring upon. How am I doing on time?
Well, you've run over to some extent, so you need, we'll finish by 7:30.
Okay, I can end then. We'll bring it up in the discussion round since I was inefficient, but essentially the 1968 exercise Black Line, this is led by the German army, it occurs at a very inconvenient time, which is right alongside the Prague Spring. And so they move the exercise away from the border with the GDR and hold it closer into the interior. And in this exercise, essentially, what all the arrows on the maps will tell you is that it's the same exact scenario. Red attacks, NATO retreats, and then eventually NATO counterattacks, stabilizes the front, and counterattacks to win the eventual war. What's really interesting, though, is by 1968, when the Germans are more in charge of exercises, there are no nuclear weapons. This exercise is a conventional exercise with absolutely no assumption of nuclear weapons usage, to, of course, prove the theory that they could defend a purely conventional attack. And well, that's where I'll end. But again, in the discussion, we can talk about the East German role in these exercises. They had a very loud one, as I ran out of time for. But that is my presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jack. We'll take, obviously, questions, and the way it's going to work is that, particularly for those people who are putting questions online, we'll, David, as coordinator, will read out the questions from people, and we might just take 2 or 3 questions at a time and for you to answer and just see how things go. The people in the room, obviously, I can just observe a hand risen. Can I start with the risen hands, David, and then we'll proceed to the online questioning? Okay, Atsuku.
That was really, really interesting. Thank you very much. And I think my question is kind of going beyond what you have just presented. When you're discussing war and nationalism, especially defeated war, is tend to seen as very crucial in either kind of crystallizing or redefining national identity, etc., etc., etc. And to what extent do you think this type of dynamics work in the military exercise where actually nobody dies or nobody really gets defeated?
Mm-hmm. Do you mean to say that the same dynamics observable in war replicate themselves in exercises? I'm unsure, because I do think the sacrifice of human life is quite essential. I really, in the simplest possible way to answer this question, the East German National People's Army hold exercises for 35 years. And when, in 1990, the East German government ceases to exist, you don't see some sort of mass uprising. There is identification with the East German Army. That's not to diminish the experience of the soldiers, but it is not to the extent, I would argue, the fidelity, the sort of feeling of belonging and self-identification with the state is not at the same level as if it were, if there was substantial loss of life.
Yeah, I thought the term national way of war was quite interesting, especially since you're bringing in the spatial dimension of war and mentioning Koselleck in that respect, because it does raise the question of the character of the state. For example, Britain, an island state, the senior service was the navy, and you had professional armies for the most part. So there's a kind of way of war which suggested all-out war, conscription war, was a threat to the liberties of the citizenry. On the other hand, to use Randall Collins' term, Britain had a protected geography by virtue of the seas, whereas Germany was a kind of interior state in Europe, fighting wars on 2 fronts, and where quick manoeuvre, you would think, was very important, was absolutely crucial, the role of railways and so forth. And Russia, on the other hand, whether they had the doctrine of war, but in practice, they used the steppe as a kind of deep defense of Russia against invasion. So the role of territory, the nature of a national territory, surely becomes quite significant, particularly if you're fighting a conventional war. Now, if you're fighting a nuclear war, I don't know what happens, but as you say, over time the Germans are beginning to think of the war as conventional, and then one would think, how did they consider the past, the relevance of the past, as a source of how they fight and how they think of themselves as Germans as they fight?
So in the American context, the U.S. is a maritime power, traditionally, and to this day predominantly spends money on its navy. Yet it always finds itself in land wars that it never intended on fighting in the first place. The same can actually be said for the idea of a British way of war. I believe someone in the comments will butcher me, but it's Basil Littlehart was one of the early theorists on the so-called British way of war, which is, again, the maritime nation uses its power from the sea to project. But ultimately, this way of war fails in the Second World War as well, because Britain did need an army, and they lost substantial numbers of soldiers. Throughout the 20th century, the American way of war, there's one scholar who theorizes it's sort of a war of unlimited destruction, that it owes its roots in the American Civil War, sort of relentless blockade, and U.S. Grant and Sherman's tactics of burning as they went. This comes to a realization in the Second World War. It's an absolute, unlimited carte blanche to use whatever firepower it takes to win. We think of the bombing campaign and, of course, the atomic bomb. This American way of war doesn't work in Germany, at least in this context, because, on the one hand, if you use the same understanding of the American school of thought of use the vast economic basis of the state to marshal resources and pulverize the enemy with firepower. Well, the enemy in this case is the East Germans. And when you have a West German ally who is rather unconvinced by the idea of bulldozing the East, you have problems. And then, of course, Vietnam is the culmination of the American failure to sort of prepare for a different way of war than they conceive of. Because in this period, the American way of war imagines great power foes, like Germany in the Second World War, and does not imagine and account for the small war enemies of, say, North Vietnam. Now, in the German context, you definitely see a continuation. This is not to imply an ideological continuation. They never refer to blitzkrieg in sort of glorifying terms. But the German conception of war throughout the 50s and 60s is more or less borrowing from their past experience, that being heavily mechanized. The entire German army was 12 divisions, and all 12 were mechanized. They were supposed to, again, reflect Germany as an industrial power, and that they would win wars quickly and have a lightning attack with close air support. The Soviets also do adopt a similar doctrine, though. So you do, as weapons technology becomes shared amongst all great powers, the question is, how do you use it? And is there national ways of war at all?
Right, well, over to you, Dave. Over your question or the ones you...
Well, I've got some here, but I've got one from me first. There was something there just about national ways of war, and I started thinking about the Kante-Kessen doctrine and Mahan and so on in Japan, but that's probably for another thing. On your chart about who was sort of facilitating the exercises, the change I think was in the mid to late 60s from being US. Now I think the Harmel report was 1967, when NATO itself is shifting from a more deterrent. We think this is going to immediately happen to look, clearly the world has changed from the immediate post World War II thing. We're going to have to deal with this for a long time. Is that related at all? And the other question is, could you tell us about the Red Team?
Yeah, the Red Team's a whole chapter. By the late 1960s, so I actually conclude my analysis in around 1969, because the situation changes dramatically. With the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt and the SPD achieving power in Germany, you no longer have the same level of tension between the two sides. But also the United States Army by 1969 is so heavily invested in Vietnam that they have fewer resources, both in terms of experienced officers and money, to hold large exercises by the 60s. Of course, they're still training, but it's not with the same gravitas and open wallet as in the early 1960s. But this is where it gets fun, as of 1970, they change the way they do exercises entirely. And they have what's called the Reforger project, or the Reforger exercises, which every German over a certain age knows. And it's where the US would fly in 2 full divisions of troops from the United States to show the Soviets, and well, in the event of war, we could do this. But it then therefore allows the US to have fewer troops in being in Germany. So just overall in the 1970s, the exercises reflects the new strategic situation. Oh, and the red team, yeah, do you want me to go into that, or?
I'd actually be very interested.
As few sentences as possible. The red team, the Americans create like a 400-page manual. They identify the names of every minister, the names of every officer, including addresses, in the fictive country of aggressor land. And it's laced with sort of judgments and very clearly pointed towards an imagined Soviet foe. And they employ this sort of fake nation in their exercises to serve as the enemy. They have their own doctrine, they have their own language, which is surprisingly Esperanto. When enemy agents on red team interrogate NATO, they have to capture NATO soldiers, they have to use the aggressor land manual to define the way that they handle that. And the Germans don't use this at all. They have just blue team and red team, and unambiguously red team is the Soviet Union. They don't engage as much with fictive literature to create an imagined enemy.
And working towards...
Sorry, Etsuko, no, I think we need to keep to the proper order of questioning.
So I've got one online.
Okay.
From Tamada Hager, talking about old experience and having the enemy now on one side. Can you give us an idea as to how many people involved in these exercises had actually been in World War II?
On the German side, I'm assuming, yeah.
I don't know. But.
Oh, okay. No, thank you, Tamada. So, it's complicated. The German armies reconstituted, or a new German army is created, depending on the interpretation, in 1955. At which point, many of the veterans, the senior-most veterans, are too old to re-enter service. You have at the highest level, like the first, general inspector of the German army, Adolf Heusinger. He was a leading Panzer general in World War II, and many of them were junior officers in the Second World War, and then later senior officers in the Federal Democratic German Army in the 1950s and 60s. In fact, the other reason I end in the 1960s for my analysis is that's when the World War II veterans are all gone.
Yeah.
Because at this point, you can always see it in the reports, the German officers are screaming about how the men with experience are now in their 40s and 50s, and they can't bear the physical burden of exercises. And the same goes for the Americans. All of the senior U.S. generals and colonels, this was higher level officers, they're all Pacific or Atlantic veterans. But crucially, by the late 1960s, you have a new cohort like Colin Powell leading the show. So in absolute numbers, it dwindles every year after 1955. I couldn't give a number exactly, but it tends to just be at above a certain rank, let's say major. You have Second World War veterans, in 70-80%, and then it dwindles from there.
Can I put a question as I've not one? That links to my question. You're talking about these young officers and their reflections, maybe 25 years old, which means in 1961 they would have been born in 1936. In 1968 they were born in 1943. So these are people who will not have known war directly themselves, except as young civilians, and war as defeat. And I'm just wondering how Kosellec's experience and expectation works. What is their experience of war? They've had no experience of war as soldiers. We know from an earlier period an aristocratic officer corps is the kind of institutional vehicle of tradition and memory. But there cannot be such an institutional vehicle in the West German army. So what is the experience against which their expectations of war? It seems to me, couldn't one actually argue almost the opposite? that for them war is A, unknown as a personal experience, and B, utterly novel because of the nuclear weapon. And that takes my second question. When Moltke devised war games in the 1850s and 1860s, he did it really to think through what would be the kind of war we would fight and how would it eventuate. And he learnt things from it. I wonder whether some of the points of these war games is actually to demonstrate to the enemy how you're going to fight the war in order to prevent the war coming about in the first place. In other words, war games have got a completely novel function, and the experience of these officers seems to me to be completely novel, and therefore I'm not sure how Kosellec's experience and expectation actually works concretely.
No, I really enjoy that. Thank you. So, when a training exercise is created, in terms of the architecture and who plans it, you're talking about a very small number of people. You might have young officers by the late middle 1960s who were born in the 30s and 40s, but the people in charge, for example, Operation Black Lion in 68, is planned by a former Wehrmacht general who is still in service in 1968. And his office is the one who determines the exact flow of the exercise. So it is true. I mean, there is a limitation in terms of the German army's institutional memory of the Second World War. It's not really a topic I go into great detail, but this is a huge discussion point in the 1960s, is how does the new West German army, and to any extent whatsoever, do they remember the Second World War experience? But they're stubborn. These old World War II veterans are stubborn. There are conferences, not just within Germany, there are conferences of old World War II Wehrmacht officers in the United States where they speak to U.S. officers. There's that one aspect. Second, throughout the 40s and 50s, the former chief of staff of the Wehrmacht in 1940, Franz Halder, he is tasked by the U.S. Army, along with, I think, like several hundred former Wehrmacht officers, of writing operational histories of the Second World War. And this literature is read avidly by the U.S. Army and not the German Army. So this is why I don't think that Kosellec's view or understanding of the use of the past is infinitely useful. But I do think there is a lingering institutional memory through these conferences and through these exchanges and also through these written works that are distributed and encouraged among the U.S. Army, less so in the German Army. But these officers, they do stick around longer than you might think.
Right. I think, do we have more questions coming online?
I've got a couple, yeah.
Good. Let's take them first as they're new people. So did you also have a question? Hi. Sorry, I thought you were looking as though you had a question.
I'm sorry, my AirPod is going off.
Oh, okay, right.
So, question from Talia. I'm curious about the dynamic of national armies performing as their enemies during these exercises. Could you elaborate on how the role reversal influences the negotiation of national identity?
It's basically it never quite works. I mean, you can't structurally. U.S. soldiers were deployed in Germany around 3 years, and they were trained to fight in this very specific space. To then, on the eve of an exercise, say, today, young men, you're not fighting in the doctrine you've been taught. You're going to now fight in the Soviet doctrine, which we glean from intelligence reports, but we cannot, of course, know perfectly. It never really quite works. In almost every exercise, there are complaints that the so-called Red Team never really fulfills meaningfully their function as the Soviet army. For example, tactically, it is alleged the Soviets will use what are called infiltration tactics, where they will split into sort of 5 fingers or however many, and attack very sharply along lines, infiltrate, and then destroy neighboring forces. That is not NATO doctrine, and that never really comes to fruition. In fact, if you read certain intelligence reports, the German officers especially are very unhappy about this because they say, well, we know what the East is like. We know what fighting the Soviet Union is like, and this does not reflect it remotely. Then, of course, there's the identification problem. U.S. forces, it was regulated what they would look like. They can't put on Red Army uniforms. That might trigger a panic. So there is actually an aggressor nation uniform, but they don't ever really wear it. They only employ the fake aggressor nation uniforms in exercises held on U.S. territory. They never really do it in Germany. That's why I didn't really mention it, because in the German context, the aggressor nation doesn't inculcate, in my view, a fundamentally anti-Soviet view in U.S. troops, but it does exist, and that is what they're trained on. So I hope that answers that question.
A potato farmer encountering a Soviet soldier might be even more worried than on encountering a German or American soldier.
I've got one last question.
Let's take the online ones. And then
Okay.
Time.
Question from Rachel. Are junior officers still elite but less elite, meaning there are gradations of eliteness? And is there also a sharp distinction between pre and post 45 soldiers? I guess that's experience from pre and post.
Yeah.
So I want to push back on the idea that military actors should exclusively be seen as cultural elites. I don't know how many people are super familiar with post-war German history, but an officer in the Bundeswehr in the U.S. in the German army, this was not a cultural elite in any meaningful sense.
No.
They were not paid particularly well. The profession suffered horrendously from recruitment problems. I think that on average, German army units needed 20 to 30% reservists to participate in an exercise to even have enough people. So this is not an elite profession. They do not carry with them significant political weight were they to publish in papers. And the U.S. Army, of course, starts from a slightly different perspective, but as John, you were saying, the U.S. is not traditionally a land power. So the U.S. Army as an institution is not the elite organization in the U.S. context. It is beneath the Air Force by a mile in the 50s. The Air Force is where allegedly the highest talent goes. In the Air Force, they claimed to have more capability to fight the nation's enemies. And then, of course, you have the Navy. So Army officers, I would argue, at almost any level, very rarely crack to the level of a cultural elite. This is evidenced by the fact that only Dwight Eisenhower, by winning World War II, becomes president, and we cease to see generals as meaningful actors in U.S. politics ever since, I would argue. Not ever since, but rarely. In the Cold War. I should really restrict that statement, but yeah.
Go back to questions from here, John, and then Silke.
Yeah, you were talking about the enemy, and you also mentioned, well, it was difficult to talk about contemporary war because we didn't have any examples. But of course we do now have an example in Ukraine, where, at least according to some reports, the Russians are referred to as the orcs by Ukrainians. So there is a kind of mass mobilization and the passions being involved, a sense of community of fate. And I think that kind of war is susceptible to the kind of analysis that Anthony Smith wrote about in his article War. He talked about the role of war in generating ethnic stereotypes, in which in a war of peoples, you have to, or of significant populations, you have to define the values for which you're fighting and for which you can mobilize people. And in the course of war, all kinds of visceral stereotypes emerge. It seems to me that the exercises here have nothing of this character. They are intellectual exercises, 400-page manuals of who is it? They're not right. You can't imagine that and particularly if the soldiers are alternating roles between reds and blues. So I wonder if your argument is about the inability of training exercises to fundamentally transform identities. because the conditions really aren't there as they would be in a kind of mass war. I think generals, by and large, in armies have tended to fear that a prolonged war of a large-scale nature would get out of hand. Moltke talked about the dangers of revolution arising from war, particularly conscript wars. But it's very hard to imagine this kind of intensity emerging from these training exercises.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if you need to reshape your analysis of the training exercises to ask a question: how far are identities being generated?
Sorry, I'm writing that down. Yeah, this is a part I'm still struggling with, because of course, throughout the 1960s, really the entirety of the Cold War, the German army and really the whole German armed forces, they struggled with recruitment terribly. You would think with all these exercises this would engender a fear of the enemy and then reflect back on society. It doesn't, though. And that is true, and that is a limitation. But I would sustain the point that the attempt is still made, and it is made repeatedly every year to try to instill young soldiers, especially the conscripts, with fear of the enemy. The fact that it fails is quite interesting, but you are right. I mean, I need to constrict and admit the limitations of my analysis, but I do think it is extremely significant that they never give up. Up until 1988, they're still fighting the Red Team enemy. And this, of course, happens on the East German side as well. But that is true. In terms of engendering ethnic stereotypes, I mean, one of the issues is they are intellectual at the officer corps level. But when you have conscripts that are 19 from New Jersey and Kansas, they're not reading these manuals. I mean, you're lucky as an officer if you can convince them in any way. And there is substantial educational material that they shove at the troops to try to get them to understand their mission. And they do play on ideas of the Russian hordes, there are ethnic stereotypes, but you are right, though. It's not so widespread that they're whipped up into a fervor over it. I have to admit that, yeah.
I think I'm asking very, very similar question to John's. Following your discussion about Red Team and having this 400-page manuals for aggressor state, etc., etc., and I was just putting everything together that perhaps one of the ways of looking at how these military exercises, to what extent, has had impact on defining or making the boundaries clearer about being German, etc., etc., is to see what impact it had to act as a Red Team, to be, if they didn't buy it, so did they, obviously they didn't buy it, so they didn't really identify with it. Did it, the fact that they didn't identify with the aggressor state or Red Team, etc., etc., did it have a kind of reverse effect of making clearer for these people that, this is what the Germans should be, perhaps?
I think something I didn't get to talk about because of just, that there's an immense project behind it. In Operation Black Line, they don't use nuclear weapons. But the German army has a very interesting change in spin. Red Team, as far as I can tell for the first time, uses chemical weapons. And they deploy chemical weapons broadly and aggressively throughout the exercise. I don't think I have the material to answer your question, which is, did the German soldiers using fake chemical weapons, acting in their role as Red Team, did this somehow reflect their view on national identity? I don't know that, but what I actually can prove is that the press picks up on this, and you see extraordinary, breathless headlines of Red Team uses chemical weapons on Stuttgart. And they follow these exercises. And so whether or not the average soldier, and this is why I don't look at letters or average soldiers, you do see in public discourse, so that's what the Russians are planning. And so you do see reflection of it. Now, to John's point, though, the public might be aghast by this. And if you look at polling information, the Soviet Union, it's like 10-12% of Germans support them throughout the entire Cold War. But they're still not like whipped up into some patriotic nationalistic fervor to destroy the Soviets. But that does, I would argue, reflect itself in public discourse. That the red team portrays itself as more sinister. Again, they're the aggressor. They're always attacking. And so, yeah, I do think that that matters when viewed beyond just the military.
Did the public actually, the press, talk about the Soviets or the Russians?
I love it. So Russian or Soviet as the word.
Yeah.
They always refer, not always, sorry. Most of the time it's Russian. In fact, you see that cross-pollinate to the U.S. Army. They almost always refer to the Russians. They don't seem to be aware of the multi-ethnic state of the Soviet Union. It is usually the Russians. And I wonder, and I don't know if I can conclusively prove it, but I would argue in this direction that the U.S. Army borrows the language of the German Army. And then the press replicates it by saying the Russians.
I mean, it would link to your point, John. Right? In many ways, you need to portray the enemy as other, and communist or Soviet doesn't do the job as well, because that's a matter of ideology, and people can change their beliefs, rather than a matter of some kind of ethnic characteristic, where you can actually portray them with particular kinds of features and habits and so on, which wouldn't...
Yeah, and along the ethnic question, which didn't come up, but I'll just throw it out there, the exercises are always against the Soviet Union. They imply that there is this thing called the Warsaw Pact, but there's no meaningful attempt to simulate Polish forces, Czechoslovak forces, etc. There's really, I mean, not that I can find any meaningful, so they do have Russian speakers, for example, imitate intelligence officers, but they never speak Romanian, they never speak Bulgarian. The enemy is very clearly a Russian-speaking Soviet soldier, almost exclusively.
Do we have any more online questions? Do you have any more? Hi, yeah.
So, from the perspective of cultural hegemony, how did the military exercises serve as an ideological tool?
Cultural hegemony. I'm honestly not as well grounded in cultural hegemony to answer it fully, but to John's question, I think there are quite limits to the impact on ideology, because I think that to a certain extent the military is still subordinated to politics, and not the other way around in this context. Whatever the attempts of the German and the U.S. Army, they're not able to overtake the larger trends of Ostpolitik and Détente going into the 70s. So again, you just don't see the U.S. public absorbing these exercises and then registering en masse to the U.S. Army, ideologically driven to annihilate the Soviet foe. And you don't see that in the German Army as well. So I would say that ideologically there are limits. There is a really good book that came out, I will remember the author's name, comparing the ideological education of the East German Army and the West German Army. And it was his conclusion that the West German Army's ideological training was lackluster and inconsistent. Whereas the East German Army, of course, was much more systematic and embraced a comprehensive program of political education for its soldiers. Calling them, of course, the army of farmers and workers. You're not soldiers, you're workers, temporarily in the uniform of the soldier, etc.
On the other hand, I mean, on the journey down to London today, I was reading the chapter from Frank Trentman has written a book called Out of the Darkness, which is about Germany climbing back into the human race, if you like, after 1942. And one of the things he shows there is that the ideological training is much more thorough and thought through in East Germany than it is in West Germany, and much less effective, because even though their living standards are going up, they're not going up as much as that of the West Germans. And I found it very interesting the point at which they not only stopped trying to stop East Germans watching West German television, but they even decided that they would sell televisions that were technically able to get the colour transmissions from the West German sets. They just knew they weren't going to win this battle, so at least they may as well sell them the television sets rather than colour from other sorts. I mean, it does sound as though it's something that's ideologically hollowing out quite quickly.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, but the beliefs are not about military, insofar as it's a positive side, it's to do with nurseries and full employment and all those kinds of things. So, yeah.
Actually, just 2 minutes. That is something I wanted to talk about. If you look at reports from the Stasi, the Ministry of State Security in East Germany, one of the things they pick up on is they follow Soviet and East German exercises, and then they ask the public, what do you think of these? And in multiple Stasi reports, early, and I'm talking 1959, 1961, where exercises are really in their nascent stage, East Germans are reporting to the Stasi that NATO maneuvers are just as destructive as East German maneuvers, and they don't believe the ideological bent of the party. And the Stasi are really quite honest about it and say, people are paying attention to German and American maneuvers, and they don't think that they're that bad, and they don't think that there's some master plan to invade the East. They don't buy the party line. And you can then later find Erich Honecker, the East German premier, reflect on exercises in public speeches, NATO exercises,
Right.
where he does try to provide an ideological explanation, but as you say, it's just it for some reason doesn't cement itself in East Germany, and the Stasi have no reason to lie to their own party leadership.
No.
So I would argue these reports are reasonably helpful.
Right. Shall we bring it to a conclusion? Well, thank you very much, Jack, for it's a tremendous project you're engaged in. I wish you well with the completion of the PhD by this summer, and look forward to seeing it in that kind of detailed written form. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.